Hello and welcome. My name is Lana Glowshot. I'm an artist and an art teacher, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I created this piece and discuss with you several of the supplies that I use on a regular basis to achieve a more painterly effect with colored pencils. If I am going for a more painterly approach, I like to work on a textured surface like sanded paper. This particular surface is Luxe Archival Sanded Paper by brushandpencil.com, and this surface is bright white and feels like a fine grit sandpaper. If you rub your finger over the surface, there is a definite texture, and this texture plays super well with a variety of different materials, which allows you to have a mixed media approach, and it also allows you to lay down layer after layer of your materials so that you can be really responsive and reactive, which is a more painterly approach than to have the entire thing planned out from the very beginning. If you are interested in learning more about sanded paper, there is a playlist with tons of videos linked in the notes below. The first thing that I typically do when I'm working on sanded paper is to take a minute to stain the surface. And I showed this or talked about this process in an earlier video and had a viewer ask this great question. Mystique Cat asks, why do you stain the paper? Won't the PanPastels create the background you want without staining? So first of all, thank you so much for your question. I like to work with colored pencils and dry materials in a way that's really similar to the way that I work with oil paint. And whenever I worked on an oil painting, I always stained the surface first. This allowed me to judge my values more accurately because I typically would stain it a mid-value color. Then I was comparing all of my colors and all of my values to something in the middle of the value range rather than to white. I also like to apply a stain because it allows me to personalize my piece with a color that specifically is picked out for my subject matter. And even though I do cover up a lot of this surface with PanPastels and eventually colored pencils, I allow pieces of this underpainting to show through, which can give it a really painterly effect and a much more spontaneous look for the final product. So, what do I use to stain my paper? I typically use Inktense blocks, which are sticks of water-soluble ink. They apply bold permanent color and come in packs up to 72 colors, but you can mix a bunch of beautiful colors from a smaller set. This is a 12 set, and I mixed a couple different colors together to get a bold reddish orange color. I like to use the Inktense blocks over watercolor pencils and traditional watercolors because they are permanent, which means that I can create really bold, intense colors, and I can even build these up with subsequent layers. If I was using traditional watercolor or watercolor pencils, which I have done on this paper before, I'm limited with how bright and bold I can make it. And if I go in with another layer, it activates the layer underneath. That's why I prefer this particular medium for my stains. The Inktense pencils and the Inktense blocks both work really well for applying a stain, and I will link a couple sets of these DERWENT Inktense products in the notes below. Perhaps the most painterly dry media that I use with my colored pencils are my PanPastels. PanPastels are really similar to a soft pastel, but they come in these pans, which allows you to use them more like paint. You use them like paint by using soft tool sponges like these to apply the PanPastel directly to your paper. Soft tools come in a variety of sizes. I like some large ones for backgrounds and larger pieces. And I also like these palette knife ones with the removable sponge applicators. The palette knife that I used was this square tipped one. And if you were to get just one soft tool, I would recommend this one. You can lay down linear marks and you can also lay down big chunks of color. So it's an incredibly versatile tool. In an earlier video about PanPastels, Nasty asked this question. These look great, but the price of PanPastels is scary. Any idea on whether there is a cheaper option to buy and see whether I like the feel of them? So Nasty, At this point, there really isn't a student grade version of PanPastels. I have only seen this specific way of using pastels done by PanPastel. They are a high quality material made with very high quality pigments, so I definitely think that they're worth the price, but I totally understand not wanting to go out and buy the full 80 set before you know if this is something that you like working with. So what I would recommend is starting with a smaller set. If you want to go really bare bones, you could just get a black and a white and do some value studies, or you could get a smaller limited palette of 5 to 7. And I'm going to link some options in the notes below. If you are interested in trying PanPastels to speed up your process and you are pretty sure that you're going to enjoy working with them, I definitely recommend going with a larger set. I have a full set of 80 PanPastels, and I love this because I don't have to spend very much time mixing colors. I can very easily find the color that I'm looking for, pick it up with my soft tools and apply it directly onto my sanded paper. And one of the main reasons that I use PanPastels is because it speeds up my process so much. So having the full set of colors helps me with that goal rather than having to mix each color individually. So that works for me, but find a set that works for you and just give it a try. The other thing that I would recommend is make sure that you don't cheap out on the sponge applicators. These sponge applicators look a lot like makeup applicators, so there is the tendency to think, well, I'll just go to the grocery store and grab a couple cheap makeup applicators and it'll be fine. But my experience has been that these makeup knockoff applicators just are not the same as the spongy soft tools. They don't hold the PanPastel as well. They make a crumbly mess. You don't have as much control over your mark making, and the other substitutes that I've seen students use, like blending stumps, paintbrushes, they just are not a substitute. So if you decide to invest in PanPastels and give them a try, invest in a soft tool as well, and I think that you're going to enjoy your experience so much more. I love making these YouTube videos. The editing, the scripting, the drawing process, and the research that goes into them is so rewarding, but it's also incredibly time consuming. If you have benefited from some part of this video so far, I invite you to nudge the like button. Doing so will help the algorithm share this with more artists. And I really would love for as many artists as possible to benefit from these videos and the work that goes into them. Thank you so much for your support. Doris asked, do you need to spray or set the PanPastels so that they won't smear when you use colored pencils over them? How heavily do you lay the pans on in and underpainting? So Doris, if you are planning to add colored pencil on top, I definitely would recommend using a spray fixative. I use a textured fixative by brushandpencil.com. This textured fixative will hold the PanPastels in place and it will add some texture back on top that the colored pencil will stick to. But this isn't a perfect fixative for a couple reasons. The first one is that it usually takes 4 to 5 coats of this textured fixative to really fix even a light to medium layer of the PanPastels onto the paper. And I've noticed as I spray the textured fixative, it does affect the color a little bit. It usually makes the PanPastel color a little darker, and sometimes these cans will splatter a little bit, so you can get a little splattery effect. I have decided that it's worth it because I end up covering over most of it with colored pencil, and I really use the PanPastels to establish the initial color and have something to respond to. But if you want more of the PanPastel coming through, or if you feel really nervous using a fixative, then I would probably keep your PanPastels super, super light and add your colored pencil over the top sparingly. Regardless of what you end up doing with fixative, I would keep your PanPastel application relatively light. You don't want too much PanPastel on there if you're going to layer more material on top, because it will end up just kind of crumbling off as you apply the colored pencil on top, making a big mess and making it difficult for the colored pencil to stick. So I'd always keep it relatively light, unless of course you're doing all PanPastel, then you can just keep applying it until it doesn't stick anymore. When I switch from PanPastels to colored pencils, I usually start with a very linear approach, meaning that I'm working more with lines than with shapes. PanPastels are applied with a fairly broad tool, especially when compared to a really fine point of a pencil. So I'm using this first pass to really bring in sharper details, tighten up my marks and my shapes a little bit more, and just to add some overall structure to the PanPastel painting. After that linear structure is complete, then I come in and I actually build up the opacity in some of the parts and I get more specific with color and texture. I don't do this everywhere though. I like to have some openness in this painting or drawing, whatever you want to call it, because I had that stain there for a reason and it's really nice for it to pop out and peek through the PanPastel and the colored pencil in a couple places. Several viewers asked questions about the type of colored pencil that I use to apply over the top of PanPastels. And my answer to this is fairly nuanced. So in this particular piece on the sanded paper, I used Luminance pencils exclusively over the top of the PanPastels. The Luminance colored pencils are softer and a little waxier and more opaque, which I find to be more like a direct painting approach where I can just put the color directly on and it sticks and it goes exactly where I want it to. If I were using something like polychromos, which are a little bit harder and are more transparent, I wouldn't have those same effects. And for that reason, I really like to stick to Luminance over the top of PanPastels on the sanded paper. But I have noticed when I'm doing something like an animal portrait that the hardness of the pencil is really a benefit when I'm rendering all of those little furs and all of those little hairs. So on those that are typically on a pastel mat, I lay a PanPastel underpainting down and then I use a harder pencil like my DERWENT Lightfast or potentially a polychromos colored pencil to apply each individual hair. So it really depends on what you're drawing and the surface that you're using and the outcome that you want. But I would keep all of those things in mind while you are selecting your color pencils. If you have a variety of pencils already, experiment around on different scrap pieces of paper to see what effect you like the best. And if you are planning on investing in some colored pencils, I would check out this video, which will talk to you all about the different colored pencils that I use on sanded paper and what combinations I like the best. If you want to add any of these supplies to your personal collection, I have included more information and product links in the notes below. I have also included a free preview link to my online course, Introduction to Classical Colored Pencil Painting. In this course, I teach artists of all levels how to use colored pencil to build up luminous works of art using strategies and techniques that have been borrowed from classical oil painting masters. Now go and have a creative and beautiful day. Bye.